Hello, thank you for joining us for the second session. We have our first speaker, Ali Haider, a lecturer in geology whose research domain encompasses oceanography, micropaleontology, biostratigraphy, paleoecology, sedimentology, and petroleum exploration.
Too many things. Here we are. Two minutes left, more time.
Second, we have Sylvain Perdigon, who is professor of anthropology in the SOM department. Then Sarah Nejim is a professor in the physics department, studying city-scale out-of-equilibrium processes, including forced refugee migration, and investigating the relationship between urban morphology and energy. Lastly, we have Raymond Brassier, who is a professor of philosophy and the author of Nylon Bound, Enlightenment and Extinction. My name is Maya Andrea Gonzalez, and I'm in the CHLA department, a professor myself.
Okay, welcome everybody.
Sorry, no, everything's undoing. Just a second.
بدنا نسكر بعد دكتور.
Oh my goodness, you can go for another round of introductions.
Today we'll talk about extinction from a geological perspective. Geological perspective means we will look at things in terms of millions of years and hundreds of millions of years. Something we cannot do in any experiment. There is no experiment we can conduct over more than 100, let's say 1,000 years. There is no experiment we can conduct over the whole surface of the Earth. Any experiment we do, it's in a lab, and the size of the lab, maximum, let's say, it's the size of AUB campus or something like that. Whereas in geology, we can do historical experiments over a very large space and a very long time scale. That's the advantage of seeing the whole Earth as one ecosystem. We don't use the term ecosystem because it's a system. It's an evolutionary system. It's an ecological system. So, three things when we talk about the Earth, when we would like to know how the Earth behaves, it's called Earth System History. We are looking at the Earth as a system, and we are looking at the history of that system. From that point of view, things we can see in geology, no other discipline theoretically can see. What's the problem with the methodology used in geology? Instead of discovering cause-effect relationships, we are only seeing things that happen at the same time. Well, not if I see an extinction and at the same time I see an ice age, I cannot say, theoretically I cannot say that the ice age made the extinction. All what I can say is that they happened at the same time. It's a historical perspective. Okay. So I started 11 minutes late. I assume I still have 11 minutes at the end. Thank you. Usually, when we talk about extinction, we have the idea that we're talking about animals. Who died out of the animal kingdom, where actually this may not be true. That's the animal kingdom. That's bacteria. There have been some extinction events in the domain of bacteria. You know that in terms of life, more than half of the life on Earth is bacteria, and the less than half is of everything else. There have been, the first big extinction was in the area of bacteria, in the domain of bacteria, because some of these bacteria, as we can see here, are photosynthetic. Photosynthetic means make photosynthesis, means they produce oxygen, and they have been doing that for billions of years, to the point that they added oxygen to the atmosphere. The oxygen that we breathe today was made by them. In the ocean, before these were active at that level for that long, there were other categories of bacteria as well, which are the anaerobic bacteria, those that don't live well if there is oxygen around. The photosynthetic forms, especially the cyanobacteria, they have been active, adding oxygen to the atmosphere and causing the extinction of the anaerobic bacteria. Luckily, in some small places here and there, the oxygen from the atmosphere dissolving in oceanic water was not being added in those small places here and there, and so some of the anaerobic bacteria survived. But the major extinction in the history of the Earth was of bacteria. So let's not get the idea that extinction means we're talking about animals only. And the event that led to the extinction of the anaerobic bacteria is called the Great Oxidation Event. Let's go through the history of the Earth, which means from now on I will show some overviews with the shape of this here, for example, where on the y-axis I have the time. It's a time scale. So we are going through the history of the Earth from early on until today. Where is the minus? That's the first overview. What's the age of the Earth? 4.5 billion years. Well, I'm not talking directly about the earliest times, because between 4.5 and 4 billion years ago, there was no life on Earth. And then we started to have life. I'm not going to go through the whole history of the Earth, only focusing on some extinction events. Here we have an example. We have types of algae about 1.8 billion years ago. They are called acritarchs. And these were with a simple cell about 1.8 billion years ago, and they were with complex cells about 0.8 billion years ago. How long it took nature to transform the cell from simple to complex? 1 billion years. What happened after the acritarch became complex? After work of 1 billion years, they got extinct. That's exactly what we should do when we listen to the rocks, when we know the history of life on Earth. That's the right reaction. Okay, how? Yes, that's the problem. How did they get extinct? At the same time, even if I would say they were killed by ice, now you understand that we don't have cause-effect relationship. There were ice ages, and the acritarchs got extinct. What's the advantage of that? We got small animals. The first small animals started after these very strong ice ages. They were so strong to the point that we can say that most of the Earth was engulfed by ice, except for some places around the equator. I'm talking always in simple terms. Okay. What do we mean by complex cell? That's an example. At some point, the competition, because extinction is what? Is two fighting against each other. If it is biological competition, one of them wins and the other gets extinct, in simple terms. The competition led to the development of bilateria. Bilateria means those living things that have bilateral symmetry, like humans. This part is a mirror image of that part. We can see that already 580 million years ago, the cells have bilateral symmetry. But before 600 million years ago, there were no animals on Earth. How do we know that? In many ways. One of them, we look at the sediment. You see the lines of the lamina and the sediment as if they are traced with a ruler. That means at the bottom of the ocean, there were not so many animals running around, because if an animal walks on the seafloor on the bottom of the ocean, the sediment will not be so well geometrically organized like this. It will be disturbed. We call this technically bioturbation. So these are not bioturbated. Most of the sediment around the world before 600 million years ago was not disturbed. There were no animals around. Another way, I'm showing you the tools we use in geology, example of these tools that we use to know about the history. How do we know if there were plenty of animals or not around? We look at the lamination. How do we know if there were animals feeding on bacteria, plenty of them, yes or no? We look at these surfaces. We call this type of surface elephant skin. You see it as if it is a skin of an elephant, where actually we are talking about something that has nothing to do with elephants. There were no elephants on Earth at that time. This is a surface in the ocean that was covered by a nice thin layer of bacteria and algae. If there were animals around, the animals would have come there and eaten them. If they are preserved, means there were no animals, not much of them at that time. So these are the tools that we use, and that's the conclusion we would come to. Again, other types of rocks. If we find rocks like this, where there is iron, but the iron is not highly oxidized, that means at that time there was not enough oxygen in the atmosphere. Otherwise, the iron in these rocks would have been oxidized. So we use rocks to know if there were animals around or not. In the ocean, yes or no. If there was oxygen in the atmosphere, yes or no. There are ways to do that in geology. If there is plenty of oxygen in the atmosphere, you see, if the rocks have a lot of iron, you see this with iron oxidized. We call these red beds, whereas we call these banded iron formation. There is a way to know if there was plenty of oxygen in the atmosphere at any time, yes or no. Again, do we know, is there a way to tell if there was an ice age? Of course, yes. When you start seeing rocks, there are many ways. These are very simple examples. If there are large pieces of rock within very finely laminated sediment, originally the sediment probably comes from an iceberg. You know, in Antarctica there is a mountain of ice that starts getting detached from Antarctica and moves to the equator, and on the way it melts and the big rocks inside the ice fall down to the bottom, making sediment like this. If we find things like this in many places around the Earth, you see there is a dot in each place we found, then at that time there was a huge ice age. There have been icebergs everywhere around. These are our tools to tell the history, examples of these tools. Okay, we go ahead with the history of the Earth. Here we are at 541 million years ago, which means at that time we start to have animals on Earth. The earliest animals are small in size, and then later we get larger animals. How long it took the Earth to produce, because in science the basic idea is evolution, so the Earth is producing the new varieties. How long it took the Earth to go from small to large animals? Tens of millions of years. That's the scale of recovery of ecosystems when a big extinction occurs. When extinction occurs, the Earth will regenerate, as Rami was saying today in the morning, but takes tens of millions of years to regenerate. Okay, how is this regeneration occurring? These are the lessons that we learn from the history of the Earth. After an extinction event, the first animals making grief are the sponges. Even though most of the time through the history of animals over the past 600 million years, corals are the main reef builders. But after the extinction immediately, the sponges are faster at making the reefs. How long does it take corals to displace the sponges and start building the reefs, start occupying the space around Australia, for example? Tens of millions of years. So when we talk about the economy that Rami was talking about, thinking not about the planet surviving, about the ecosystem servicing humans. Many of you have seen the discussion today in the morning. And so corals are useful to the environment. Let's try to preserve them. Sponges, we don't see where they are useful. No. Without sponges, the reefs don't recover. The early ones to make reefs after extinction are the sponges, not the corals. Here are the archaeocyatids, which are relatives of sponges. There is a rule, not a rule, a trend that we observe when an extinction happens, which means when there is a change in the evolution and the ecosystem, new groups appear, old groups disappear, that at some point soon we start observing predators. When it has the shape of a tooth, very likely it belongs to a predator, to someone eating someone else, an animal eating another animal. So ecology is faster than evolution. Ecology, building the food chain, this is a process that is an ongoing process. It keeps happening. Every time by evolution something disappears, something else appears, very quickly on a scale not of the order of tens of millions of years, on a much smaller scale, the pyramid of the food chain is being rebuilt quickly. That's how we know about the presence of animals and how these developed on Earth, starting 600 million years ago. Older sediment is like a lamina, as if we put a ruler and we design it, and then the sediment gets disturbed and more disturbed. That's what we mean by bioturbation. Sediment disturbed means there have been plenty of animals living at the seafloor. Okay, so what happens in terms of diversity, in terms of biodiversity? What if we look at the whole history of animals, over 500 million years of biodiversity? What are the main lessons we learn over that big time scale? These are two graphs. The red one is the old way we were collecting the data. Today we have a more detailed way, which is the blue curve, but more or less they show the same pattern. The pattern is, first we have leveling off of taxonomic diversity, as to say diversity was going up and down around a certain level and remained around that level for a long time, for about 400 million years, between 200 and 400 million years. And then suddenly diversity started going up. So all what we talk about today of decrease of diversity, of catastrophe, of whatever, actually we live on the very big time scale, not on the time scale 1900 till today, on a much bigger time scale of hundreds of millions of years. We live in a period of increased biodiversity on Earth. Same for climate. Today we talk about global warming. If we look at the past 40 million years, we live in a global cooling period. So before saying diversity goes up or down, climate is warming or cooling, tell me what scale you are looking at, what time scale. Because the conclusion might be the opposite at different time scales. Again, looking at the history of the Earth, now we are at 443 million years ago. Here, this line, the horizontal line, means an extinction event. This extinction was due to an ice age. So far, there are 4 times, there will be in total 7. 4 times so far, 7 times at least in the brief overview that I'm showing, ice was the reason for extinction. We should not say the reason, as I said before. Imagine we can say it. If ice is the killer, the lesson to learn is don't romanticize the ice. Today, what is the media doing? They go to the polar area, they take a picture of a polar bear standing on a piece of ice 5 by 6 meters, and the title below the picture, the caption is, what if this polar bear loses that little piece of ice under his feet, losing its ecology, its environment, its habitat? Don't romanticize the ice. Too much ice is a killer. That's what we learn from the history. That doesn't mean that global warming is good, but global cooling is a killer. Okay. So, one of the most dangerous people, I know many people will not like this statement, but I think I have to say it. One of the most dangerous people to ecology is الناشط البيئي. The environmental activist is the enemy of the environment, because instead of basing their requests, their political/social requests based on scientific research, they do it based on wrong ideas, things that we listen to from newspapers and from media, and they are so powerful. Sometimes they become so powerful that they can enforce their ideas and transform them into law, and this law, not being based on research, they destroy the environment. Beware from environmental activists. Okay. I'm sorry to say that.
Can you give an example?
Give me more time at the end. Let me use my time for my presentation. We'll talk about it. Okay. This line here means ice age, an extinction event that happened at the same time of an ice age. What do we have here? Every time we draw these two lines, it's a convention. That means evolution radiation. Evolution radiation means at the beginning you see the width of the line is not so much. That means low diversity. At the end, the width of the line is bigger. That means high diversity. That's evolution radiation, increase of diversity over time. How long does it take for diversity to get back for this regeneration? How long? Tens of millions of years. Look at this time scale here, 443 million years ago, 419 million years ago. Regeneration occurs, that's true, but takes tens of millions of years. If the purpose of ecology is that we need the ecosystem to service humans, that's too late. Tens of millions of years. We cannot wait so much for the system to regenerate. Although I don't agree that ecology has to service humans. I don't have an answer to that, but I don't necessarily agree that this is the purpose of ecology. Okay. Again, expansion of glaciers. What do we have here? Extinction. But there is a pattern in that extinction. We have first the corals die out, first the species that live in warm waters in an ice age die out, and then those that live in cold waters die out. Here, about 252 million years ago, the biggest animal extinction ever. Why do we say animal? Because the biggest extinction is that of bacteria. But in the animal, over the last 600 million years, including the extinction we are witnessing today, the biggest is not that of today, the biggest is 252 million years ago. What happened at that time, environmentally speaking? There was a huge volcanic eruption, Siberian traps, which means in Siberia and parts of China, and that was covering, the lava was covering a surface hundreds of times the surface of Lebanon. Hundreds of times. That's another extinction. What happened? Why did we get this? Because at the same time we have an ice age. Who is the first to make the reefs after this horizontal line, after this extinction? Sponges. Corals take a long time to come back. Here, at the same time of this extinction, in the sea, we get development of giant insects. How come an ice age can make a giant insect? Actually, at the same time, we're having an increase of oxygen in the atmosphere. What's the proportion of oxygen today on Earth in the atmosphere? 21%. At this time, how much it was? 35%. So, we are seeing now different types of reasons of extinction. Some of them are at the physical level, like an ice age, or a volcanic eruption. Some of them are at the chemical level. Also, volcanic eruption has chemical effect. Here, increase of oxygen in the atmosphere. Some of them are at the biological level, extinction of acritage, development of small animals. So it's very hard to find a trend, to find rules, to say, oh, this happened in the past. If this happens again, we will have an extinction again. There is little repetition in the trend. That's very hard to study as an ecosystem. Okay, this is an evolution radiation, again after an extinction. You see, now there is a pattern, at least in this. Big extinction, big evolution radiation, which means big increase of diversity after extinction. Very big extinction, very big evolution radiation. The size of the evolution radiation, apparently, as long as we have animals on Earth, which means this is true only over the past 600 million years, the size of the evolution radiation is proportional, between brackets, to the size of the extinction that happened immediately before. Who else is making reefs? Crinoids, which are part of the echinoderms. Is it true that immediately after the extinction we got the crinoids? No, it took time for crinoids to come back. How much time? Tens of millions of years. That's the increase of oxygen. That's the level of oxygen today. It's 21%. In the past, at some point, it was 30 or 35%. Again and again, going through the history of the Earth. This line here is an extinction event. I made it on purpose quite thick, the red line, because this is the one at 252 million years ago. That's the biggest animal extinction ever. Look at how many evolutionary radiations, how much regeneration of diversity has occurred after this extinction, given that this is the biggest. That's the extinction. We have three elliptical shapes, which means three parts of the evolution radiation. Which one is that of corals? The last one. How long it took corals to come back? More than 15 million years. Who is first? Let's see that in detail. How do I get information about life immediately after the extinction? First, I have elephant skin. Elephant skin means a time when we had no animals eating the bacteria and the algae. That's the first part. The second part, sponges are making the reefs. Now it's a rule. When we have extinction, who makes the reef first? Sponges. Who makes the reef later? The corals. How long does it take the corals to come back, to displace sponges? Tens of millions of years. That's the dinosaur extinction. At this line here, about 65 or 66 million years ago, dinosaurs got extinct, but not only dinosaurs, plenty of other things in the sea, etc. What happened at the same time from an environmental point of view? An asteroid impact. There had been a big asteroid 10 kilometer wide falling on the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico, affecting all of Mexico, all of the United States. Of course, at that time, the map was different than that of today, on one hand. And there had been a huge eruption on land in India. Now we have a recurring pattern for extinction. There have been plenty of eruptions in the sea, and together with the time of these eruptions, no major extinction has occurred. We have few major eruptions on land, and together with the time of these, there have been a big extinction. So not eruption, eruption on land is associated probably with extinctions, provided that it doesn't cover an area at the size of the IUB campus. It has to cover areas of tens of times to hundreds of times the size of Lebanon. Another thing, these are types of bivalves. We are all used to the bivalve being of this shape. You tell me when I am out of time. If we look at these are bivalves with the lower valve extending down like a cone. They are called rudist bivalves. These were, at a certain point in time in the history of the Earth, able to displace corals. Why? There had been a change in the chemical proportion between calcium and magnesium. What's the reason for this extinction? Chemical. How much time I still have?
5, I think.
5, okay, great. Here is the evolution of leaves of plants. Today we get any leaf of a plant, the lines, let's call them informally the veins on the leaf, are so well geometrically organized that it comes to our mind to ask how come. Actually, there have been certain times early on in the history of the Earth, in the Cretaceous time, which means before 65 million years ago, where these veins were not well organized geometrically, but these, because of the strong wing, were subject to tearing. So there have been extinction of those, extinction by the effect of wind, physical reason for extinction. There was extinction of those leaves that did not have a good geometrical pattern, and those surviving had a better geometrical pattern. It's a natural selection process. Again, here we have pulse of extinction. Here we have reefs of corals appear. How long does it take? Tens of millions of years. What's the reason for this last extinction? We will not talk more about that. Change of the position of continents. Antarctica and South America, if they are next to each other, a current cannot run around Antarctica, and so the ice cannot be preserved on Antarctica. If Antarctica and South America get a little bit separate, a current can run, as it is the case today, and current can run around Antarctica, and plenty of ice on Antarctica, the climate changes. Here, that extinction has to do with the change of position between Antarctica and South America. The last thing is here, and then I stop. Here we have a big extinction event. We have an evolution radiation. How long does it take? Tens of millions of years. Look at the age here, 66, 56 and more, about 20 million years. But the recovery is not of the same types of animals that are gone. Who is gone forever. Thank you.
Next we have Sylvain Perdigot from the Department of Anthropology, SOM. Take it away.
The first thing I want to say is that I'm truly grateful to Nadia and the Critical Humanities for the Liberal Arts Program for initiating this series of events, including actually inviting an environmental activist to give a talk tomorrow. But no, personally, I think it's one of the most important things we can do at AUB right now. So the invitation we received from Nadia was to offer perspectives on extinction from our disciplines. So I'm going to try to do just that and to go very quickly through 3 directions or entry points for thinking about extinction from the vantage point of my discipline, which is anthropology, and from the vantage point of its history, but also of my small practice of it in Lebanon. So the first possible entry point is that has to do with extinction in the short history of anthropology as a discipline. The point here is that extinction has not been a peripheral concern in anthropology, but indeed, arguably, it's one of its organizing concepts, or perhaps more accurately, imaginary, for a good chunk of this history. By extinction, I mean in this context, the context of the history of anthropology, not the extinction of life forms, of species, like, I mean, in the sense that, which is what we tend to think of when we think of extinction today, but the extinction of forms of life, human forms of life, which is what anthropologists study, specific arrangements for collective living, including for living with the non-human, along with the premises or the background assumptions internal to these collective arrangements for living. And by this I mean, by premises I mean things like, for example, the bear is my relative, okay, or God is outside of the world and created the world for humans. Okay, this is what I call premises or basic background assumptions. So if we consider that anthropology emerged as a discipline at some point in the mid-19th century, then for a good first half of this history, from the 1860s to the 1940s, we find that anthropologists, by and large, took it for granted that the forms of life they were looking at were forms of life well on the path to extinction. Or to put it, I mean, to say the same thing in other words, that extinction was the future and even the present of the forms of life they were looking at. This is especially true, surprise, surprise, for American anthropology or the anthropology of the Americas from Morgan, so who is taken to be the founder of modern anthropology, with the Iroquois in upstate New York in the 1850s, to Claude Lévi-Strauss with like the Nambigvara in Brazil in the late 1930s. And the Boeotians, the American anthropologists called the Boeotians, and their program of salvage anthropology in between. This premise or assumption that they were looking at forms of life that were going extinct operated as a justification to establish the legitimacy of the new discipline. Forms of life had to be documented and studied before they go extinct. And at the same time, it authorized very dubious methodological, analytical, and theoretical moves, and not to mention the pillage of artifacts and human remains to fill museum collections. In the last 2 decades or so, these anthropological imaginaries of extinction have come under devastating critique, with indigenous anthropologists especially pointing out that it is precisely because extinction was a thing so easy to see for these anthropologists that it was also so hard for them to see that what they were seeing is what today we would call genocide. So I propose 2 takeaways for discussion from this first entry. One, it's a cautionary tale. Imaginaries of extinction are sticky. Extinction is something dangerous for the human mind to handle and imagine and even talk about. And 2, these early anthropologists, and they were not idiots. I mean, they were very smart people, so we should not. These early anthropologists, with their intellectual affinity for extinction, who had no problems, no difficulties imagining the extinction of, say, the Iroquois or Kwakiutl or Nambigvara form of life, and imagined it with a kind of nonchalance, we could say, what cannot but be struck by how there is something that they were incapable of imagining, and it is the extinction of their own form of life. The dismantling of their own arrangement for living and of the system of premises internal to it. So I throw at you the question of how different, in fact, we are from them, and what it would mean to be different from them in this respect. The second entry point or perspective okay. I will take it from my own practice as an anthropologist. In the last 4 years, I conducted research with shepherding families and their flocks in the highlands of Lebanon. These pastoralists and their animals practice the transhumance, meaning that they move between high and low areas with the seasons, and most of them are semi-nomadic Bedouins. Here I'm playing images from this. We try to make a movie in this research. So it's to give you a feel of what it's like. It's actually, in this case, it's not a Bedouin shepherd. Of these shepherds, always on the move, we could say that they steer their sheep and goats, indeed maybe at the edge of extinction. By this I mean that only meager chunks remain of the share of the earth previously accessible to them, and these chunks become narrower each passing season for reasons which I don't have the time to explain, but we can talk about it. What would go extinct if semi-nomadic Levantine pastoralism went extinct is a system of food production based on principles totally at odds with those of intensive farming, I mean factory farming, that sustain current habits of meat consumption. So in their case, it's bringing the animals to the food rather than growing food to then bring it to the animals. I mean, Rami spoke about that this morning. The reliance on entirely renewable resources like high mountain wild pasture, the intertwinement of the animals' happiness, okay, meaning that the shepherds, they said their animals need to be happy for the thing to work, and so the intertwinement of that and of the livelihood of the shepherd. What would go extinct with them is also, beyond that, a multi-species form of life, honed over millennia of co-evolutionary interactions between humans, animals, and plants. The sheep was the second animal that was domesticated like 10,000 years ago, and held together by unique forms of animal-human communication, and indeed, I would say, the partial domestication of humans by sheep and goats, okay, of which the transhumance, actually moving with the flock, is an aspect of that, what I call the domestication of humans by actually a non-human form of life. But it is not just that which would go extinct if Levantine transhuman pastoralism went extinct. What studies of transhuman systems around the Mediterranean have shown is that typically there is more biodiversity. Okay, so not more biomass, but more biodiversity in areas located on circuits of transhumance than in areas excluded from grazing. So, to put it clearly, the move of sheep and goats on long stretches of land boosts biodiversity, at least in Mediterranean systems. Okay? This might sound like a surprising or counterintuitive result, but there are actually a number of reasons for which it is so. My favorite of which being that transhuman sheep act like huge bees in the sense that they carry seeds and pollen in their wood and they spread it, okay, and in their poop also. This, so that's actually, you have a number of studies that show that. This also seems to be the case for transhumans in Lebanon, and here I speak under the authority of Mustafa Itani, an environmental scientist who actually worked at some point at the NCC, Nature Conservation Center at AUB, who worked with us and is now doing a PhD on the topic in Helsinki. So, and this is what apparently they're going to find. So this supplement of biodiversity is also what goes extinct when a form of life like transhuman pastoralism becomes impossible to perpetuate. So I also propose that there are at least two takeaways for discussion from this second entry point. The first takeaway is that you should support your local transhuman shepherd in any way you can. And the second takeaway is that there is an ecology, what I would call an ecology of forms, okay? And here I use the word form with a deliberate indeterminacy that facilitate passages between life forms, species, and forms of life, collective arrangements for living together. So there is an ecology of forms that comes well into focus in a case like that of Mediterranean transhumant pastoralism, but which is also obviously what comes into focus in a negative fashion with the sixth extinction. So there is an ecology of forms which is not reducible to the ecology of energy and matter flows, which is by far the predominant or hegemonic language in which we're constantly invited to represent to ourselves global ecological breakdown. And I think it has many consequences, including for how we teach ecology and things like that. Finally, the third and final entry point or perspective I want to open is the case and thought of a 20th century anthropologist who is perhaps whom we can see as a precursor perhaps for what we're doing today and tomorrow, in the sense that this anthropologist not only became capable of imagining the extinction of his own form of life rather than that of primitive others, but in fact he spent the last 15 years of his career from the mid-1960s onwards arguing that the dismantling of a specific life infrastructure and of the system of premises that underlie it was an urgent task to organize in front of the global ecological catastrophe that this form of life, his form of life, had precipitated. So I'm speaking of Gregory Bateson. Bateson put his argument in the language of an ecology of the mind, and so it's his most famous book. And I think actually it is quite relevant in a discussion of extinction organized and hosted by the Critical Humanities for the Liberal Arts program. What does it mean, an ecology of mind? It sounds a bit like something an old hippie would say, but in fact it is very hardy and concrete. Let me quote from a text that Bateson, it's actually an address that he gave in 1969. There is an ecology of bad ideas, just as there is an ecology of weeds, and it is characteristic of the system that basic error propagates itself. It branches out like a rooted parasite through the tissues of life, and everything gets into a rather peculiar mess. When you narrow down your epistemology and act on the premise, what interests me is me or my organization or my species, you chop off consideration of other loops of the loop structure. You forget that the eco-mental system called Lake Erie is part of your wider eco-mental system, and that if Lake Erie is driven insane, its insanity is incorporated in the larger system of your thought and experience. Bateson thought of himself as a lousy writer. He certainly struggled to convey what he meant by an ecology of mind, but I think that in this passage he does it very effectively and felicitously. The passage does not mention extinction explicitly, but the ecology of weeds phrase is a reference to the disequilibrium and impoverishment introduced in ecosystems with invasive species. So the passage, in a sense, just presents the basic form or loop structure of ecological thinking. Anything that lives within a larger web of life. No organism or species that destroys its environment, that goes beyond a certain threshold of changing the dynamic equilibrium of its environment, can survive. But of course, what is striking is that this concise presentation of the form and structure of ecological thinking is conveyed in the language of mind, or minds, several minds, okay? There is talk of ideas, there is a lake being driven insane, and there is a lake's insanity invading your mind in return. I just said ecological thinking is conveyed in the language of mind. I didn't say through the metaphor of mind, because I don't think that for Bateson it was a metaphor. One way to put it very succinctly, and I have to be fast, is to say the following. There is an ecology, so there is an ecology of bad ideas, meaning that there is also probably an ecology of good ideas, but even more fundamentally, there is an ecology of ideas tout court, ideas, including the ideas we teach in our classes, or those we exchange in this room. Ideas, for better or worse, are part of ecology, exactly like bird songs, the shapes and scents of flowers, or the rich communicational repertoire of postures and calls in a pack of wolves are part of ecology. Of course, this is not how we typically think of ideas, including in the routine work of teaching ideas in a university class. And surely if the ideas we teach in our classes, for example, are part of ecology, like bird songs, I said, they are also part of ecology, not exactly in the same manner as bird songs, and it is a complicated matter to unwind how they are part of ecology. And in a sense, I think this is why we are together in this room, and what interdisciplinarity is about here. For Bateson, in the end, it was so because ideas are part of natural history. Ideas are always, ideas are always what he called ideas of relationships, ideas internal to relationships, or ideas that are not the ideas of one participant in the relationship, but the relationship itself as idea. Meaning also that the boundaries of mind are not those we typically take them to be. Transhumance, as a matter of fact, is a good example to get a sense of what it means. It's the name in human language of this idea internal to a specific relation between sheep or goats, landscape, altitude, plants, and the temporal cycle of seasons. Okay, and it's an idea which, by the way, was invented by sheep, and I mean by meaning wild sheep and goats actually transhume, and not by humans, which is probably why it's a good idea. So we saw that it is a rather good idea from the point of view of biodiversity, as opposed to intensive farming, or to monotheism, or the corporation, to quote examples of what Bateson analyzed as bad ideas, prone to branch out through the tissues of life. So I've already talked too much and I have to wrap up, so I'll just close with two takeaways or propositions which I think follow from the perspective opened by Bateson. First, if there is an ecology of mind, meaning also that the boundaries of mind are not those we typically take them to be, then the ongoing event of mass extinction is also a catastrophe in this ecology of mind. That is, it is a mental catastrophe in every sense of the phrase, meaning, so I'm thinking of the fact that every species is a form of intelligence, okay, and it's going down, but also I'm speaking of the fact that we're all indeed, I think many people feel that we're living through times where we're all getting a little bit crazy. And then, less grandly and more humbly, there is the role of the university in this matter. And I would say the topic of the ecology of the ideas that we teach in our classes. And here I'm speaking of the topic of ecological literacy, but also the more difficult topic of universities as incubators of bad ideas, okay, in the sense of Bateson. Thank you.
Thank you. On that note, the Department of Physics, Representative Sarah.
you, Maya. Thank the panelists as well. So as with the previous speakers, I need to put in some prelims for what I want to speak about. And as Maya told you, I come from physics, and I tried to put in a presentation with no equations, and that's kind of very hard in our discipline. So you have to bear with me with the visuals, and I hope they're going to be helpful. And as the title is alluding to, I'm going to talk about complex networks as a way of looking at extinction. And you see a picture that's going to become very essential in nearly the end of the presentation. So what do I mean when I talk about networks? A network is a kind of representation of an interaction between elements. We call them nodes or vertices. And the links or interaction, the relation between these elements, we call them links or edges. Okay, so we can represent this room now as a network where you guys are the audience, we're the panelists. So that's what we call a bipartite network. So there's a relation that is audience to panelist, and that's pretty much a network. And we can represent a classroom where you see your students, there's a professor, that's another kind of network. So any kind of interaction can be somehow cast into what we call a network in our discipline. And what scale are we talking about? We can represent any interactions from, let's say, the cellular scale all the way up to the city scales and beyond. But I have chosen Escher's metamorphosis to it's a compilation of both metamorphosis 1 and 2 to show you that you have interactions, let's say at the cellular level, where cells are coordinating among each other, and there's a network associated with that. You see there's bees, there's fish, there are birds, there's cities as whole. So these are systems with interacting components, and these components are called nodes. The relations are called vertices. And you've definitely come across a lot of them. Your brain is one of them. There's the interaction between your brain cells is represented as a network. And this thing here, which is the link between each of these cells of the brain, is called the human connectome, so how cells are connected together. And that's a very huge network. You can think of social networks. Here you have what you call forced migration networks. This is a real network of the Syrian war. So you see there are people flowing from one city in Syria to another city in Lebanon. So that's an interaction network of social migration, but it's forced migration. You can also think, if you want me to go back, I can slide back. Yeah. Then there's the Saddam net. So that's pretty much the inner circle of Saddam Hussein's circle. And I mean, that's pretty much encapsulating who knows who's and who talks to whom, and which ties very nicely to the ecology of ideas in a sense. And that's pretty much a field on its own in this complex networks approach. So how do we represent these networks? Mathematically, that's okay. You can skip the slide if you're not into math, but if you're interested, you just build a matrix of the size of your classroom. So let's say you have 10 students, you build a matrix of 10 by 10, and then you start linking rows to columns. Okay, so first row, first column, that's the relation between 1 and 1. Okay, so that's pretty much how you represent them mathematically. And that's pretty much the prelims. That's Networks 101. Okay, so now we've moved to a kind of intermediate course on network science. And I'm going to throw at you a word that is topology, okay? And might be scary, but it's actually very intuitive. How do we characterize networks? So I have on the slide 2 videos, I hope they work, to convey this idea of triangular relations. So, I mean, it's very straightforward. I know Nadia, for example. Nadia knows Maya, but I don't know Maya, so that's not a triangular relation. So I just met Maya. But if everybody on this triplet is connected via a link, then that's a triangle. And that's what we call a transitive relation. So I know Maya, Maya knows Nadia, Nadia knows me, we all know each other, that's a triangle, okay? And that's what you see here. So you have 1 is connected to 2, 2 is connected to 3, 3 is connected to 4, so they make up a triangle. Unlike what you have here on the right-hand side of the slide, where you see F is connected to A, and C is connected to A, but there is no link between C and A. So that's not a triangular relation, okay? So we just come to know each other, but there is no transitivity in our relations. Okay, so that's a very cool checkpoint in math. There's another notion that is called the degree of a node. And so I pick a random person in this room, and I ask you, how many of these people do you know in this room? Or how many people you're connected to? And that's the degree of a node. So I pretty know like 3, 4 people. So that's my degree, okay? And every one of you has their own degree. And if I come to plot the histogram of how many people know 4 people, how many people know 2, how many, that makes up what we call a distribution, okay? And this is a very important characteristic of networks. So how connections are distributed in a network, okay? So let me show you here. Here you see, like, node K has 2 connections. Node E has 2 connections. Node C has 2 connections. And then I hope I have 1. F has 1 connection. So if I then plot the histogram, I would see how many are connected to how many. So this is very important. And now let's try to do a representation of a totally random process. So we come into this room, nobody knows no one, okay? And then you're here to mingle, and you start picking a person at random and try to talk to. In a couple seconds, you build a connection. Okay, so that's us pretty much when we just came in. Nobody knew anybody. And then you start, the conversation starts, and you start to make links. And as you make links, you're looking here at the right-hand side of the slide, there's a histogram. So there are 1 person who knows 40% of the people, 4 person who know like 5% of the people. And you see that it's a distribution that is kind of something that reminds you of a Gaussian, but it's not a Gaussian. So it's like a bell-shaped curve, but it's not. It's what we call a Poisson distribution. Okay, but a Poisson distribution is a characteristic of what we call random networks. Okay? So if I tell you what is the likelihood of you being connected to someone, you just look at the average. And that's pretty much what characterizes random processes. So there's nothing governing the link making. You're just randomly bumping into people, talking to them. What else is a characteristic of networks? There's what we call the path lengths. So a path is pretty much just the number of hops you need to make to reach someone. So let's say F wants to reach C, but there's no direct connection between them. Okay, so obviously F has to hop to A, and talk to A and tell them, okay, I want to talk to you. And that's what we call a path of length 2. So there are 2 hops that take you from F to C. Okay, but obviously there's 1 hop that takes you from A to F, A to C, etc. All right? And then what's special about these path lengths, so imagine now I have more of a regular network topology, something that looks like this, this table, okay? So everyone is connected only to the person right next to them, okay? So if I want to pass on, let's say, a piece of cake, had I not been fasting, I would have appreciated getting it. So someone wants to pass that piece of cake from that end of the table. It's going to take a lot of time to reach me, right? But, and that has to do with the regularity of connections, because I am only connected to my nearest neighbor. But assume now that I have a direct link where I have something to slide, let's say, the cake on, and that's going to reach me very fast. It doesn't need to go through one person after the other. So that happens, the drop in the path lengths, or the number of hops I have to make, happens when I have these long-range connections, direct, okay? So I have a direct connection. Someone throws something at me from the end of the room. So that makes the path length drop very low. Okay, that's very good. Another notion in topology is what we call modularity. So modularity, if you look at this network, there's connections in there. You can see that there are some nodes that are more interconnected with each other than others. And these somehow densely connected nodes are what make what we call modules. So they're highly interconnected among each other and share less connections with nodes of the other group. Okay, so, and I'm going to come back to this later. Hopefully I'll remember. And then there's a notion of centrality. And centrality is also a very kind of intuitive idea. Someone is central. Okay, so let's kind of also look at it in a more visual. Hopefully this would aid us formulate the centrality in a more quantitative manner. So let's look at A, for example. Or let's look at F. If I remove F from the network, okay, nothing much is going to happen. I could still, let's say, reach C from D, right? And let me replay. So if I remove F, I can still go from C to D. I can still go from D to E, etc. But then if I remove A, I totally lose connection. And that's a notion of centrality. So A is very central to the network, and its centrality is measured in the way it affects connectivity. So if you try to think about it, it's the node that has the highest number of shortest path, right? So F has to go through A to go to C, because for F to reach C, it has 2 hops, right? So A is a necessary node on the way. Okay, so we're kind of ready now with all the topology and prelims to kind of say something about these networks in relation to extinction. We've probably heard this notion of a small world and 6 degrees of separation. Who has? Okay. So there's this Milgram experiment who wants to pass on mail from one side of the planet to the other, and he asked us to do it with direct connection. So you just start to send it, and you put in the names and the people who reached it as an intermediate, in the intermediate way to reach the end receiver. So on average, it ended up being 6 degrees, okay? And that's a very interesting notion when it comes to path lengths, enterprises as well, but follows what we call a power law distribution. يعني, let's look at this node here. You obviously see that it has a lot of connections, and that's a central node. So there's a few nodes with very high connections, if you look at this. But there are a lot of these nodes which have very low connections, okay? So these are the peripheral nodes, while the central nodes are the ones with a huge number of connections. Okay, and why is this relevant? Because of the following. If we know that ecological systems are kind of small world or power law networks, they're very vulnerable to a certain kind of attacks. Okay? So, I mean, you can visually now identify the most central node in the network, right? It's that red dot in the middle. If you disconnect that, you pretty much disconnect the whole network and you incur the highest damage in the network, right? But you can also see that the kind of orangey nodes are of a lesser importance because, I mean, if you remove that, you're just going to disconnect this part of the network, or you're going to retain the rest. And as you move from the center to the periphery, things become less and less important, okay? And that's very important when it comes to ecological networks. So this approach, I mean, of casting systems into networks is a very general approach. It does not apply only to ecological networks, but I'm kind of approaching the topic of extinction from the ecological networks perspective. And just to tie it up with Ali's presentation, it's a matter of timescales that you're interested in. So if you're interested in evolutionary timescales, you have to worry about other interactions. But if you're interested in ecological timescales, then your nodes become, let's say, species. Okay, and the interaction between them become these edges. Okay, and if you have a node which is a species that is probably at risk, you can sort of simulate the effect on the whole network. In a sense, you remove it, and you see what is it that it affects as a process. So there's a cascade of extinction processes that happen along the way because of this removal of nodes. So obviously, the more central the node is, the more the damage incurred on the network. And so if you want to say something about, let's say, the consequence of some human action or environmental action, it's not enough to just, say that there's a removal, but you also need to see what is it connected to measure its effect and how it percolates over the network. Let's say you have severe overfishing or habitat transformation, an invasion or contamination. So the response of these networks must be followed. So you identify the node, and then you just, like, let's say, kill it off the network and see what happens to the structure as a whole. And of course, network robustness differs. Okay, so if you have, let's say, a specialist species that is deleted compared to a generalist one. So, I mean, the ones that are more robust to environmental changes, if they undergo an extinction process, it's going to percolate in the network. Unlike these specialist species, which are somehow represented by peripheral nodes. Masalan. We're so irrelevant to that. But also, there's a very important thing in the process, that it's not only the nodes, but the order in which the nodes are removed. So there's, let's say, if you remove them randomly, if there's no, planned extinction, forced extinction procedure, you're not going to incur the most damage. So if you're just like, you pick you let's say, throw a dice and you pick the number, and then you just remove, it's more than a dice, like more than 6, but imagine a random number generator, and you just remove the node associated with that. And if you look at the damage incurred on such a network is minimal compared if you look at nodes that are very central. So if you kill off the most central node in this network, the damage is going to be huge. But it's also, you can argue that, okay, if I started off with the yellow, and then I moved to another yellow, and then back to another yellow, I can pretty much incur the same damage as killing off the red one. So the sequence in which these, extinction events are happening is very important. So this is pretty much just species interaction, but you can overlay on top of this, let's say, environmental factors, let's say human contamination of some sort, habitat erasure. So this becomes another network of interaction, and there's full interdependence, right? And the cascades become more amplified when you have these coupled layers of networks one on top of each other. So it becomes more dramatic when you have interdependent network. And I'll give you an example. Let's say we were fully running on the fully functional Électricité du Liban, which we're not, right? So because of our dependence, let's say if we were fully dependent on that, any damage on any of the generators or transformers would pretty much percolate. It's going to affect, let's say, a whole region, a whole sector in the power grid. But since we're not, we have other layers of redundancies, right? We can somehow manage to get our sources from somewhere else, okay? So because, I mean, imagine, but this, I'm showing the example here in Italy. I can't remember the event, but I mean, the power grid was affected. And then the subway was affected, and then the landlines were affected. So, I mean, the fact that you have one, let's say, network controlling the layers is going to affect all dependent layers and incur more damage, and that we call them catastrophic cascades. So these catastrophic events can happen when you have these interdependencies in networks. So this, I mean, this approach then still applies to, I mean, we just looked at kind of, not with the fullest, but you know, I alluded to the use of these networks in extinction in the context of ecological systems or ecosystems, but you can think of it, and that has been done in the context of enterprises and startups. You know, they come to life, they hang in for a while, and then they go extinct. Going back to Sylvain, it's also ideas, because, I mean, ideas, or even, I mean, they're carried with humans, and then humans are nodes. And then the transfer of idea from one person, but it's not at the brains level, but it's more of a social exchange of ideas. So you throw in an idea, I mean, someone else throws something more challenging, and it just disappears. Because of that particular node-to-node, now ideas are nodes, and the interaction between them are just, you know, either precursor or somewhat of an annihilator. So how much time do I have? I think, yeah, خلاص? Yeah, I mean, I'm fine, so I can put in some questions for people to kind of mull over, and we can talk about them in the discussion. I think I'll just slide to the thank you slide.
Thank you so much, Sarah. And yeah, we'll return to your questions.
Yeah,
Sorry, I didn't get to finish.
I hope I kept my promise. I didn't put in any equations, and I think it was a very accessible physics.
Bravo. All right, on to Ray. Go ahead, Ray.
Okay, right. So I'm going to discuss extinction in a way that's related to Sylvain's talk. I'm going to talk about cultural extinction, or the extinction of societies, civilizations, or ways of life. Okay, and I'm going to do so by talking about a book written by a philosopher called Jonathan Lear. The book is called Radical Hope: Ethics in the Face of Cultural Devastation. It was published in 2006, and in this book, Lear considers the case, what happened to the Crow Nation in what is now kind of United States of America, and the way in which they came to terms with the death of their culture. Okay. So Lear's narrative focuses on a Crow chief and warrior called Plenty-Coup, who was born in 1848 and died in 1932. Now his Crow name, which is very difficult for me to pronounce, was Alaxchihaouche, which was translated into English as many achievements, or Plenty-Coup, where a coup is a strike against the enemy. A coup for the Crow is a way of winning prestige against the enemy in battle. And by planting what they called a coup stick during battle, the warrior marks a boundary which cannot be given up to the enemy. By striking an armed enemy with a coup stick, the Crow warrior shows his exceptional courage, and this act was considered braver than killing the enemy. Plenty-Coup's name indicates his exceptional standing as a Crow warrior. He was thought to have between 50 and 100 feathers on his coup stick, each one representing an act of valor. In 1876, age 28, he was elected chief of the Crow Nation and became their representative before the federal government. Although his negotiations with the government allowed the Crow to live on reservations located upon their ancestral lands, unlike many other nations, they were forced to give up 80% of their original territory. In 1928, at the age of 80, Plenty-Coup recounted his life story to the writer Frank Bird Linderman. And it was published in 1930 with the title American, the Life Story of a Great Indian, Plenty Coups, Chief of the Crows. Now, Lear's account pivots upon a single enigmatic sentence from Plenty Coups' narrative, as written down by Linderman. And this sentence is, after this, and the this that Plenty Coups is referring to is the disappearance of the buffalo, nothing happened. Plenty Coups' life and the life of the nation he represented is split into a before and after. But this before and after is not marked by an event in the ordinary sense. What splits Plenty Coups' life in two is something that marks the boundary between the possibility of events and their impossibility. With the destruction of the buffalo, the life of the people who hunted them and who fought wars over territory inhabited by the buffalo also ended. An existence fundamentally organized around hunting and war became impossible. Thus, Plenty Coups' formulation indicates in Lear's words, quote, a loss that is not itself a happening, but is the breakdown of that in terms of which happenings occur, end quote. What does this mean? Crow life was oriented towards the activities of war and hunting. They made sense of themselves and of all their activities in these terms, counting coup, hunting buffalo, fighting off the Sioux. Quote, even an everyday occurrence like cooking a meal potentially opened out onto a way of life. At least in principle, such an act could be described as getting ready for a hunt, getting ready for battle, getting ready to move on, making sure we're ready for tonight's dance, etc. So in other words, even the most apparently insignificant events, cooking, cleaning, washing, all of these events were meaningful within this kind of structured totality, this form of life, as Sylvain put it. But consignment to the reservation terminated war and hunting, and with them, the Crows' ability to make sense of their own lives. And what follows then, in Lear's account, is an exhaustion of temporality and subjectivity, an exhaustion of the sense of time, in a way the structuring of a human life in terms of a past, a present, and a future, but also an exhaustion of subjectivity, in other words, of there being someone for whom things happen, someone for whom something has happened, is happening, or will happen. So there's no time when this can be said to be happening, and there's no subject for whom this happening can be said to be constitutive of their identity. Now, human existence is defined in terms of possibilities of activity, but once the framework of intelligibility in terms of which these different activities make sense collapses, then the possibilities through which existence orients itself also collapse. But without an intelligible horizon of possibility, there is no future to speak of. So the collapse of meaningful activity is effectively the collapse of the future. There's nothing to be anticipated, nothing to be projected in advance of whatever it is you're doing now. Lear is optimistic. The collapse of one cultural horizon of possibility does not entail the collapse of human possibility as such. The creation of new frameworks of meaning, a creative capacity he assigns to the human poetic impulse, but also to written narrative as a record of past forms of life, forges continuity beyond cultural catastrophe. And this is why he thinks Plenty Coups bothered to tell his story to someone. He still thought there was something valuable about telling an American journalist what happened to his people. And in the case of Plenty Coups, this faith in the possibility of forging a symbolic continuity beyond the end of the Crow way of life is also indicated by his symbolic act of acknowledging the end of this way of life by laying down his coup stick at the grave of the unknown soldier. he was the sole representative of Native Americans present at the dedication of this tomb in 1921. This was, the American government, created this tomb for the unknown soldier after World War I. Now, in acknowledging the death of his people's way of life, Plenty Coups performs a symbolic act that acknowledges the necessity of forging a new one. Thus, says Lear, quote, "There is reason to think that Plenty Coups told his story to preserve it, and he did so in the hope of a future in which things, crow things, might start to happen again." End quote. Lear aligns this creative capacity with the power allotted to dreaming in crow culture. The dream transmits an enigmatic message about the world, not from the human unconscious, but from superhuman divinities. As a young man, Plenty Coups dreams about the replacement of the American buffalo by European cattle. And this replacement presages the replacement of native hunting by settler agriculture. According to Lear, the dream provides a way for Plenty Coups and the community he represents to envisage the transition from their hunter-nomad existence to a sedentary agrarian existence under the settler colonial dispensation. So Plenty Coups' dream is a response to anxiety instilled by the crow's sense, his people's sense, that with the arrival of the white man, their way of life has reached its limit. The white settlers represent an existential threat to which the anxiety of the dream is an appropriate response. Appropriate because it registers this sense that crow culture has reached its existential limit, but also because it urges the crow to create a new form of life. They can't keep going on as they have. They need to invent a new way of living. In Lear's words, quote, "The dream charged young Plenty Coups, and by extension the tribal elders who interpreted it, to anticipate a future they did not yet know how to think about." End quote. Through the dream, the crow are able to project themselves into an enigmatic future. And what the dream teaches, according to Lear, is the value of learning to listen and learn from others, even from white men, so that some new possibility of existence might emerge from the collapse of an existing framework of possibility. So, Lear's fundamental claim is that forms of life, cultures, societies, are ontologically vulnerable. They can become extinct. Because their finitude is inescapable, it's an ontological datum, what is required, according to Lear, is an ethics of what he calls radical hope. And this is an ethics of catastrophe, of learning to live beyond the limits of a way of life, which would inculcate in us the ability to transition from familiar to unfamiliar life forms by creating new customs, new virtues, new habits in response to the encounter with cultures and worlds that render ours impossible. The radical hope encrypted in Plenty Coups' dream, according to Lear, encapsulates the following reasoning, quote, so this is what he thinks is Plenty Coups is thinking, or how he reasons about what must be done to somehow survive this catastrophe. "My commitment to the genuine transcendence of God is manifest in my commitment to the goodness of the world, transcending our necessarily limited attempts to understand it. My commitment to God's transcendence and goodness is manifested in my commitment to the idea that something good will emerge, even if it outstrips my present limited capacity for understanding what that good is." End quote. So, the dream enciphers a divine message. It is a sign that the world transcends the finitude of humanity. The world's limitless goodness exceeds my limited conception of the good. And so I should have faith that some hitherto unenvisageable good will emerge from the ruination of what I currently conceive as good. And this is what Lear calls radical hope, which he presents as a variation on Kierkegaard's teleological suspension of the ethical. This is simply giving everything up in the hope that it will be returned to me although I know not how. This is what faith entails, according to Kierkegaard. To have faith in God is to be willing to sacrifice everything you have, simply, you know, with the faith that it will be returned to you, even though you don't know how. And Abraham exhibits this faith when he's willing to sacrifice Isaac. Radical hope is the faith that what currently seems hopeless, the collapse of the future in which all my previous hopes were invested, will yield new, albeit currently unrecognizable, possibilities of human fulfillment. And Lear insists that the commitment to radical hope is not the commitment to, quote, the idea that history has a beneficial direction, or to the idea that its current order has a divine sanction. So in other words, he's not praising Plenty Coups for learning how to submit to the ineluctability of white European civilization. As he sees it, radical hope is perfectly compatible with the uncompromising rejection of that civilization. And yet Lear contrasts the anachronistic courage of the Crow, who fight against the destruction of their life world, anachronistic because the world which made it possible to be courageous in this way has ended, with the irony of Plenty Coups' acknowledgement that this way of life and this form of courage have ended. The word from Plenty Coups' dream which Lear fastens upon to describe the destruction of the Crow's world is storm. Okay, the arrival, the destruction of the buffalo is a storm. Cultural extinction is presented as if it were a natural phenomenon akin to biological extinction. An ontological vulnerability is thereby naturalized, as though human life worlds were biological species. But the slaughter of the buffalo and their replacement by cattle was not a storm. It was a calculated strategy on the part of the settlers. Every buffalo dead is an Indian gone, as one US colonel told a wealthy hunter. Lear presents radical hope as an antidote to cultural and existential despair. Life will go on some way, somehow, even if we can't imagine it. But despair need not be paralyzing. It can also be rage-inducing. And rage may spur organized resistance to orchestrated annihilation. Lear's ethics of catastrophe can be contrasted with a politics of extinction capable of countering willed extermination with methodical resistance. Resistance in the face of extermination does not simply preserve the past or perpetuate the present, it transforms them by prizing the future free from the grip of those who would appropriate it for themselves at everyone else's expense. Faced with the theft of the future, resistance seems a more appropriate response than irony. And what is conspicuously absent from Lear's account of radical hope is an analysis of the disparity between forms of life or cultures, which are local by definition, i.e. spatio-temporally bounded, and this is their finitude, and the systematization of life and the syncretization of cultures effectuated by capitalist colonization, which is global and neither spatially nor temporally bounded. Capitalist accumulation requires limitless expansion in both space and time, which is why the capitalists are already thinking about colonizing the solar system and other planets. Once the Earth is wholly subsumed, and once it's become a kind of a radioactive cinder, you simply move on to other planets. Yet in Lear's account, neither capitalism nor colonialism contribute decisively to ontological vulnerability. He substitutes existential competition among human cultures for what is in historical reality the gradual subsumption of all human cultures by the capitalist mode of production, which uses human needs to satisfy its inhuman imperative to produce what no one needs. Understood historically, the agent of indigenous extinction is colonial expansion, whose motor is capitalism. The colonized cannot make peace with the colonizers without abjuring their self-respect. Ontological vulnerability is not like biological mortality. Colonization is an onslaught, not an encounter, as Lear's cultural pluralism would have it. In his account, radical hope is the virtuous response to a world that exceeds our capacity to understand it. But this is to elide the distinction between the world that exceeds our ability to grasp it and the colonizer who destroys our capacity to understand it. In this regard, there is an asymmetry between the wars waged by the Crow against enemies like the Sioux and the war waged by the colonizer against the colonized. The former involves an intelligible rivalry in which victory and defeat alternate, whereas the latter threatens the intelligibility of this distinction and this alternation. And against this, local rivalries would need to be overcome to unify against a global enemy. This is the only way in which you resist a colonizer. Thus, resistance to colonization is not just a reactionary refusal of transformation. It's compelled by the emancipatory refusal of the monotonic transformation dictated by capitalism. Tradition is transformed by the struggle to preserve it. And while the imperative to survive at all costs depreciates the value of survival, the desire to preserve something worth living for entails the willingness to die for something beyond biological survival. Through this resistance, a culture is not merely preserved, but transformed and extended into the future. It is precisely those who are prepared to die resisting who have not given up living. And this is the paradox of extinction. Those willing to give up living affirm the future, while those willing to give up dying deny it. Lear thinks that Plenty Coups' compromise allowed the Crow to survive. But he is wrong. All that survives are their biological descendants. Who can claim to be, who can call themselves Crow if they so wish, but they, in a sense, they're not, because the conditions for living as a Crow no longer exist. And this is precisely not transformation, but commodified role play. So the example, so all this to say is that there's a way in which the willingness to die can be the only way to carry on living, whereas the willingness to carry on living under imposed circumstances, even if it ensures biological survival, is already the death of everything that makes life meaningful and valuable.
Thank you so much to all of our panelists. That was, this is really difficult for me to try to find the common thread, except perhaps that in every case there's a decentering of the human as the focus of extinction to a certain extent. And I think that this is so where we ought to go in the humanities, thinking not only of the ways in which the problem of extinction, on the one hand, it is often considered a part of or renaturalized, or the Anthropocene is seen as a geological a period, in relationship to humans' specificity as superior to other life forms, and this is often renaturalized through scientific discourses. And the problem of the Anthropocene, in some sense, is the fact that on the level of politics, it puts the responsibility in some way on human beings, even though it's human beings are obviously less central than we seem to believe they are, and that we live in an ecology of relationality, but also that on some level the suffering and the fact that there's an unequal and interested and not human but inhuman drive for accumulation that in some sense inaugurates this period as beyond human, and yet at the same time blames humans using a kind of liberal dramaturgy in which we are everyone is and no one is to blame, and particularly naturalizing that which relationality and inequality and political existence which might actually intervene into the process. And so I just wonder how intervention can be thought for each of you and through one another's presentations, and intervention, even if you are not going to privilege the human, but to denaturalize at least the notion that we have to accept extinction simply because there is it is beyond just the human yeah, I wonder if there's a sort of reverse in Sylvain's approach to thinking about the fact that oftentimes we use natural science discourse and the sciences to renaturalize the human relations to our own extinction, whereas what is this kind of thinking is to imagine human language and to invert that. And I just sort of, I think that that's an interesting approach to start us off with seeing how we can sort of speak through one another's disciplines and think through each other's languages.
I can try to give it a go. I guess from the perspective of, I mean, the complex networks theory, definitely a human is only a species in a network of complex interactions. And the effect to which, you know, human interventions on this network, I mean, percolate or diffuse through the network is can be totally random. It can be totally irrelevant to the whole ecosystem in a sense, because on the one hand, this approach to looking at ecosystem is what we call out of equilibrium statistical physics. So we're in a state of out of equilibrium, constantly pumping energy, constantly consuming it. And that's life pretty much. And so there's no stagnation in the sense that, you know, there's an equilibrium, in the sense that they're what we call steady states that are, you know, phases of constancy, but they're not there to remain, because, you know, Ali's approach to looking at extinction from a systems perspective, I think, is the right approach, because, I mean, there's no one element that affects the whole. And I think if one can see it in a simple, you know, aerial display of a flock of birds. You see there's total coordination, but there's no one, leader of the flock in the sense. I think, well, the Anthropocene is our, perspective on looking at how much humans have affected, our this era as a whole. But there could be a very minute node in this network of interaction, though their effects are huge on the human themselves. But as Ali talked to us about timescales, so timescales are very important. So when it comes to humans, okay, millions, 10 millions of years is huge for us to, go through a phase of extinction. But on the scale of this planet as a whole, I mean, these are just natural processes happening, and they, as you saw, there are multiple of these processes. They erupted millions of years after you got the recovery. So I think when it comes to intervention from a complex systems perspective, it's a bit kind of absurd to think about intervention when things are that complex and multi-layered. At least from the ecological perspective, I mean, that's my take on the matter. I don't know if I answered your question or not.
Intervention, I don't know, and we have to accept extinction, so it can mean several things. There is, I think actually, there is a question of grief. We didn't talk a lot about that, but there is something, another example actually where we see extinction in the double sort of, both under the aspect of forms of life and, life forms and forms of life. It's the case of now, actually, we have a number of species. They exist only as zoo animals. Okay? The only way to prevent them from going extinct as a life form is to actually keep them in zoos. But actually, they're already, in a sense, the form of life is already gone. There is a wonderful, actually, anthropological book, which is an ethnography of a conservation center for orang-utans in, I think, Malaysia, where they're actually, it's a refuge of sorts where they're getting these orang-utans, from the, who need a refuge from the palm oil like agriculture that Rami mentioned this morning. So they get them there, and then the project is to reintroduce them into the wild, and they're actually literally trying to teach them how to live again as like forest animals, and it's not working, and there is a way in which the form of life is gone. It's not working. So things like that, they go, I know when I taught that, it was a very awkward atmosphere in the room, in the sense that you feel actually a very deep grief when you read like very specific accounts of like how this species disappeared, like so accepting extinction, it actually, I think there is a question of grief, what we do with that. And then, so another way to take it is, actually, this is why I said extinction, actually, let's be careful, because it's something a bit dangerous for the mind. We get a little bit crazy when we use this concept. I think it's very easy to veer into a form of nihilism. So especially the perspective of deep time. So let's contextualize that in the perspective of deep time. And like Lévi-Strauss actually at the end of Tristropic, where he says the world started without man, and it will at some point man will disappear. And okay, but so, for me, there is a nihilistic temptation associated to that. So I guess in terms of So I wouldn't say accepting extinction, but accepting that we live in times like that. And then in terms of intervention, I think the discussion we should have, I mean, if we wanted to keep our feet on the floor a little bit, is what does it mean, for example, for what we do in a university, actually. And I mean, now actually the office of the provost is gone, so I can't say. I mean, universities are also, so they're a unique space actually to have to think very deeply about these times, and at the same time, universities in the current, I mean, in the historical present, they're major incubators, as they like to say, of bad ideas, bad ecological ideas. So there is this gap. I would say the most important thing to think about, it's the gap between what we know about what's happening and what's going to happen, and how we live. And this gap is extremely troubling, including, I would say, even in our everyday university life.
That's a very important question, by the way. What can we do? What should we do? Let's go from a practical point of view. If someone goes to a lawyer and explains to the lawyer, I have a problem, A, B, C, can you solve it for me? What usually is the reaction of the lawyer? What do you want? If we have a problem, which is the environment, we cannot say we have a problem that is the environment. The question is, what do we want? How do we think about the environment? We have different options. Let's take end members. One, which is preserving the planet. We already talked about this in the sessions of the morning. And the other is servicing, which means thinking about the ecosystem as servicing human survival. If we think about ecology and preserving the environment as saving the planet, then if we are facing any problem that would require the extinction, imagine an asteroid hitting the Earth, either we don't have a time to deviate it completely so that it doesn't hit the Earth at all. We have only a minimum range of maneuvering, which means either it hits an area full of people, or it is another area which is a great ecosystem, like the Yellowstone National Park, whatever beautiful place. If the purpose is to save the planet, then it is an option that we let the asteroid kill people instead of killing other ecosystems. If this is our choice. If our choice is to save humans as first priority, then we're not talking about the environment. We have an egoistic, between brackets, point of view that we would like to save humans. If this is the case, which is a point of view of power, not a point of view of ecology, because we are the powerful ones, we decide how to deviate the asteroid, whether we would like that asteroid to hit Earth in point A, not in point B. So that mindset is a filter of power, not a filter of ecology. If we accept this, then someone else would come and say, you human species is a lot of things. If we have the asteroid to hit city A, which is full of powerful people, and city B that is full of people, maybe more people but less powerful, let's hit A or let's hit B. So directly the simple choice of deciding that helping or preserving the environment is a matter of power, if this is our way of thinking, then those in power may say that they have the right to preserve themselves instead of those that are not in power. Okay, so it's a very difficult question. I'm not saying I have an answer to it, but I have many questions in it. A typical question that I ask during class time is, if we are watching a video where a tiger is running after a giraffe, and a video is made of many snapshots. In snapshot number 1, the distance between them is big like that. Snapshot number 2, snapshot number 3, and the distance is getting smaller. And then we stop the video. Is it a good or a bad thing? We're not talking about humans. Is it a good or a bad thing that the tiger would eat the giraffe? Some student come and say, yes, it's a good thing, the tiger needs to eat. Okay, fine. Now we watch another video where the tiger is running, always with the distance being bigger first and then smaller and smaller. But now the tiger is running after my sister. I'm giving this example on purpose because I don't have a sister, so that we avoid other types of problems. Okay? These are very big questions. Why very big questions? Because these questions, once we answer them, we decide what type of intervention we make. Are we making interventions to help the powerful, which is in this case the human? Or we are saving in total life on planet? In that case, we may sacrifice all humans in exchange for the survival of ants or whatever. These are very big questions. First, we answer these questions, and then we answer the question on what do we do to preserve the environment. Because if we would answer the question in a way that we help humans to survive as first priority, then we are in favor of environmental constructivism, which means the natural environment is no longer our priority. Our priority is the artificial, البيئة التركيبية, artificial constructive environment, which is where we all live. We cannot live without internet, we cannot live without laptops, we cannot live without this, without that. Then this would be our choice. Then the answer to the question, what do we do as intervention to save the environment, will be directed in another direction. It will not be to go back to the environment of before, because as a philosophy we have chosen the constructive environment, not the natural environment. So, and that implies a lot of philosophical things. I will not go longer. Before we decide what to do, let us make a choice. What do we want?
I'll just say, about, I don't know much about ecology from a from a scientific perspective. I don't know about the physics and biology of ecology, but I think the term, one thing is I think that every description of an ecosystem, I think, the extent is what is there a notion of equilibrium which is implicit in the notion of an ecosystem? In other words, is there an idea that ecology is about some kind of optimal, equilibrium between competing biological interests. Okay, so an ecosystem comprises various kind of flora and fauna, and often the assumption is, well, a balanced ecosystem is one in which there is kind of the maximum diversity, the greatest variety of flora and fauna, with minimal kind of conflict or predation or whatever and a kind of an unhealthy kind of ecology would be one which is out of equilibrium, in which there is a kind of an apex predator. In other words, it's a self-destructive ecosystem, an ecosystem that cannot perpetuate itself. But the question is, in all these, I take Darwin's philosophical message to be that life isn't for anything. Okay, DNA doesn't want anything. It just wants to replicate. And ultimately that competition amongst organisms is driven by adaptation. And, it's, the reason that there's more bacterial biomass, most of the Earth's biomass is bacterial, is because the best replicators and survivors are bacteria. They're best at replicating themselves and at kind of surviving. So clearly, there's a problem here, is that we can't simply mean, when we talk about, what is kind of healthy or unhealthy, ecologically, then we have to be very clear about, we can't smuggle in an idea of optimal equilibrium, which assumes that there is some kind of ideal harmony between the vital interests of competing flora and fauna. Because that's from whose point of view? Okay? In any ecosystem, I mean, either you have the idea of a kind of a nature without predation, without competition, and I don't know much about biology, but I know that there's collaboration, and that Darwinists overemphasize competition at the expense of collaboration, but clearly there is lots of death and predation in nature. So the question is, if you say this is just, what is just the right amount of death and destruction in nature? And this is a problem. As soon as you start saying, okay, this is the right amount of death and destruction, but now this is too much death and destruction. There's an invisible hand, like there's a kind of an implicit, there's an evaluation. Every description of what is the case surreptitiously invites what should be the case. And that's philosophers have been saying this for a long time. So what you can't do is naturalize, is pretend that your description of an ecological state of affairs is kind of neutral, and then you have to decide, which is why the question of the human, I take your point about how there's a kind of myopic anthropocentrism which is destructive for all other species, and we're seeing it right now, but it's also destructive for the human species, because humans are animals, and whether they like it or not, they depend on other creatures to survive. So this is the question. So then the question is, if humans are embedded in nature, then the question is everything that human beings do exhaustively describable in terms of physics and biology? If you believe that, then everything is ultimately about systems and about complexity and dynamics, equilibrium, disequilibrium, etc. But it seems to me that there's something about social systems which is not easily reducible to physics and biology. There's a level of agency in which human beings, have interests. They forge interests as a kind of, on ethnic or racial or class lines, and then they engage in politics. And if you recognize, then you have to recognize that there's a dimension of, what societies do to their biological environment isn't simply, there's no one-way determination from that environment. Societies also reform and reshape the environment in the pursuit of certain political interests. And it seems to me you have to understand this kind of double dynamism, or this two-way dynamics, so as not to simply naturalize society, not to think that human extinction, the extinction of human societies and human life forms, is simply a kind of a continuation of the dynamics of biological distinction, or worse, to think that humans deserve to be extinct because they've been so bad. Okay? Because that's just, and lots of people say, well, humans are really bad because they've killed everything else. But I don't think nature cares, okay? So in that regard, I think, and that's why intervention involves being able to, disintricate, political agency from biological kind of dynamics. So what happens in the case of what happens in the American plains in the 1800s, this sudden disappearance of a species. Here, there are cases in which correlation is causation. The disappearance of the American buffalo is not just reliably correlated with European settlers, the appearance of European settlers. We know that they did this deliberately. It was orchestrated. It was planned. And it seems to me implausible to say that, this can also be explained in terms of physics. Some people want to say this, but I think that's implausible.
Yeah, it's not a reductionist approach to, the complex world, but this added layer of social interaction, you can think of it as a network. So let me give you an example of like a social network over which, social, like let's say Facebook or one of these virtual social networks over which ideas diffuse. And you've spoken about agency. So every node which is associated with an account has a person, more or less, unless it's a bot, with some, you know, background and political affiliations and, you know, all sorts of socioeconomic baggage. But when it comes to physics or the physics description of such systems, you think of these as forces, so they align you one way or the other. So it's not that, you know, everything is somehow, one way of it is kind of hiding all these under the rug and calling a force field on each of these nodes, accounting for these different agencies. And funnily, we know of a lot of social systems that completely interact. I mean, their macroscopic behavior, or what we see at the macro level, though there's agency at the individual level, they act in a completely predictable manner. So I've shown a slide where I think Nadia had just looked at it with some the Syrian migration. So the migration of the Syrian refugees to Lebanon, you'd think that there's a lot of, you know, bless you. There's a lot of variability among, you know, the Syrian population. Where is it that they decide to go? But when we looked at the data, I mean, the whole thing collapsed into something very predictable, in a way that people were tend to choose a haven, which is somewhat of a very similar religious, political, social standing. So I mean, though the agency is, you know, there at the individual level, but, you know, as a collective, you start seeing more of a predictable behavior. So, I mean, this is the approach of physics. Though, you know, if you zoom in, you might completely lose predictability at the individual level, but at the macro level, things somehow average out to very predictable archetypal behavior in a sense.
No, I completely agree. I think it's the scale, the level of description. The scale of description is important. There's obviously, I'm not saying that, you know, I guess what I'm saying is that agency, in the strict sense, is actually quite rare. It emerges under systemic determination. It's to say that there's always more in a system, more going on in a system that can be reliably represented by all the available, you know, kind of information, which is why you get things like history, like revolutions. Was the, you know, is 1789 predictable? Is 1917 causally predictable? If you had a kind of an exhaustive description of all the kind of the comings and goings and tendencies and kind of systemic dynamics operative in Russia in, you know, just before October 17, would you be able to predict the, and I think that, no, but that's not to say there's something mysterious. That's not to say this additional factor is not immaterial, it's not transcendent, it's just the idea that it's because these systems are so complex, in certain peculiar circumstances, small groups of human individuals can act in a way, concertedly, in a way that has systemic ramifications far and above the causal powers of these individual people. I mean, think about how what a small handful of people can do can have massive societal impact. And then, and I think, so the argument is whether that can be predicted in advance, whether the kind of, that's simple, yeah.
Concerning the network representation, so let's say it's going to represent like a biological environment. So the biological environment has a type of inherent adaptability within it, because, you know, it's made up of organisms that interact and that basically connect or reconnect or disconnect, etc. So let's say, for example, you have the dot in the middle and you have 5 connected to it, and then 25 to the 5, and so on and so forth. Let's say that you remove the one in the middle. But since the system has a type of capacity to adapt itself, So it does not collapse immediately, but you see that the 5 dots make a connection between one another, and you have adaptation. So let's say that now you reintroduce the core one, you reintroduce the nucleus, the one that connected everything else. Would you have again the previous original system? Yani would the dot in the middle reconnect with the 5 and you will have a new system? Because this can also be connected to the idea of the crow, because when you said that they removed the buffalo, so everything else collapsed. But now in reservations in America, if they reintroduce the buffalo, would we come back to the crow civilization? Or would this new system that exists now in the reservations, where people have adapted to technology which is westernized, don't want to go back to their roots because they can still do it if they reintroduce the buffalo? So I think it's just a bit of the two ideas together in a certain way, maybe.
If I may start with the idea of the network and the node, you're raising a very interesting question in complex networks. So I'll give you the example where this has been kind of tackled. You have a leaf, okay, a plant leaf, and you see it's full of branches. And they come and poke a hole along the veins of the leaf. And part of its adaptability is, you know, it wants to sustain the flow of nutrients across the branches. So what the veins would do is that they rebranch and reconnect so that they optimize the flow over the network. And then it takes time for the leaf to heal. And when it heals, the network is a completely different network. It does not go back to where it was. No. Because you're optimizing over a completely different structure where it considers that there's a hole in the leaf. It might regain connections, but it no longer would be that central in the sense. No, absolutely not. Yes, absolutely not.
Can we actually reconstruct the original system, or are we always going to have a new complexity that actually completely negates the primeval situation or the previous situation?
Yeah, in a sense, if the time scale of these redundancies to happen is slower than the time scale of recovery of that removal, then you cannot go back. You cannot, But if it's happening at a scale that is, you know, very fast, I mean, the recovery of that node, then you recover your original network. Thank you.
If we would like to think about your question from an evolutionary point of view, when some species are extinct, they are gone forever. And so the new product, if we would think about any new species as a product, usually is completely different than the old ones. But in some cases in the evolutionary history of animals, there have been some, I don't want to say repetitions, but getting back to similar forms. For example, about 252 million years ago, when we had the biggest extinction ever of animals, the corals got completely extinct. How can we have corals today if they got completely extinct? The corals of today, biologically, we may not be, strictly speaking, we may not be allowed to call them corals if we would call corals those that existed before. That's number one. So in some cases, things reconverge back to similar forms, not exactly equal. Or there are some publications talking about the crabs. Why everything evolving randomly may have a little tendency to go to make a form of a crab. So there are major trends in the evolutionary of biological systems, in my case, and probably in network systems, that may be due to some laws of the second law of thermodynamics, etc., where it's true that they will not get back to the original exact position, but there are some places where things converge more into one place than into another.
Just a small follow-up on your input concerning this idea. We know that we have now a new technology of genetic engineering, and so basically we have the capacity maybe to resurrect species. And so the question is this: so can you, at a certain time, if this technology develops further, isn't it possible to recreate in a certain way what existed like millions of years ago? And so basically it will be going back, but due to a human agency in this case, it will not be like in a natural, spontaneous process.
To answer this, for example, on dinosaurs, we have in the fossil record the remains of bones, if they are not very old, for example, if it's less than 1 million years old or 1,200,000 years old, we have a more complete genetic code in the fossil record. So if we would like to reconstruct a species that is already gone, we have, and that is gone only within the last million years or even less, then we have a better chance to get the genetic code. We need at least the code so that we know what we want to put in the new species. If we don't have the code, that's gone. Whereas for dinosaurs, we have in one case genetic codes. Dinosaurs already extinct, the non-avian dinosaurs 65 million years ago. We have in one case genetic code, but we don't have it complete. We have only some segments here and there. How can we reconstruct the exact dinosaur if we don't have the entire code of it?
So this morning when we were hearing about monoculture and agriculture, I was thinking about this colleague I went to grad school with who wrote a dissertation about monoculture and monolingualism. And then I was thinking about this book by Sarah Schulman, Gentrification of the Mind, that was a very kind of impactful book for me because until I read this book, I don't think I really understood what kind of the fairly recent past looked like what the sort of environment of New York City looked like before everything got, sort of eccentric people got replaced with, tech bros and sort of, everything started to have a name like the Nest or the Nook or, and my experience of both Sylvain's and Ray's presentations, at least the part about the ecology of bad ideas and the kind of idea about the devastation of culture, the loss of culture, is that you both provided kind of theoretical accounts of something like that process. And I would sort of like to invite you to fill in the theoretical account with more descriptive or empirical kind of detail, and maybe I'll sort of try to pose that question in a slightly different way to each of you. So for Ray, I think I'm basically wondering, so I understood you to be saying, if this is wrong, correct me, but I understood you to be saying something like, okay, so Jonathan Lear has this ethics of hope, and your kind of rebuttal, it sort of remains at the ethical level, right, which is that in this kind of monotonic devastation of meaningful action, which capitalism has imposed on all of us, which has kind of foreclosed a future in a certain way already, that the only kind of ethical possibility is the exposure of oneself to death. And the alternative is sort of going on living kind of anyway. So what I think if we were to sort of switch the lens from the ethical proposal to the kind of alternative, what would that look like more sort of, what do you think it does look like descriptively? And then maybe the way I want to pose that question to you is just you've brought up the university as an environment that is malignant to good ideas or produces bad ideas or is a bad environment for ideas. And is there anything else you want to say about that?
Well, I mean, empirically, the only empirical example I can give is what's happening in Palestine. I mean, that's exactly what I'm talking about. You can't, there's, and in a way you said, am I simply kind of proposing an ethical rejoinder to Lear? Well, what I was trying to suggest was that he's proposing an ethical solution to a political quandary. Colonization, there's no ethical response to colonization. There's only a political resistance, and it has to be collective and organized because you have to understand that it's the existence of an entire culture, society, and an entire kind of social system that is under threat. And I think that it's because it invites, you can only resist colonization collectively. You have to, it's transformative. It means precisely that you can't rely, you're facing a threat which is incomparable with any threat you've faced before. This is not just a kind of a new rival tribe competing for, for territory or for buffalo. This is an alien civilization, which will destroy your entire way of life. And it forces you then to kind of, to reckon with what you think is your way of life worth fighting for, okay? Is it do you want to stay alive? And if so, why do you want to stay alive? Because there's a sense in which no one wants, are the conditions of life that your conqueror or your colonizer offers you, are they, desirable or acceptable? And then, but that question assumes that, of course, there's never any possible negotiation. It's that either you submit or you die. So that's why there can only be a political resistance to colonization. You can't negotiate or engage in dialogue with a colonizer. So that's why I was trying to, and now I realize that what I said, that's why you have to be willing to die for something, but I didn't mean it in the sense, precisely, it's not in the kind of the familiar existential sense in which death is only ever a radically individual matter. It's only my death, okay? It's, in a way, what I'm proposing is that this, the threat of complete annihilation is, can forge a way of being together for something which is not just, it's not like Heideggerian being towards death, which is, that's a fascist politics, because then the point is that confronting death is noble in and of itself. And the whole point of death is the whole point of life becomes this exposure to death. That's not what I'm saying. The point is that you have to risk this exposure collectively to live, to win a future. And I think that that's politically important because there comes a point, and the Palestinians have been told this, why don't you just submit? Submit and, it's better if you submit. If you submit, you'll survive. And there's plenty of people willing to tell them, you're so stupid, this is so self-destructive what you're doing. You're only going to visit death and destruction upon yourselves. And first of all, I think no one is in a position to tell people, how to live or how to die. And if people decide that they want to they refuse to be subjugated in this way, and they're willing to die to resist this subjugation, I think that is, personally, I think that is something entirely admirable. And I don't think it's, that's why it's, I don't think Hamas are a fascist death cult, which is what the New York Times wants you to believe. Simple. I think they're actually fighting for something, but the viciousness of their enemy means that they used to have tactics like the French resistance did in the Second World War, which, which are incommensurable with the horizon of liberal politics. You don't negotiate with someone who's trying to exterminate you. That's what I mean by a political kind of response.
Were collaborating with the colonizer against the Sioux, and how, and in part because the boundaries of their world or their form of life were, caught in that gambit, which maybe is more like the state of Kurdistan or something in relation to this than Palestine. I was just thinking about how the form of life of the nomad and of the Crow as opposed to the Sioux or a more powerful, I don't know. Either way, I just wonder if there was already a defeat. And in the case of fighting and for the dying vestiges of the possibility of that game that they played, the form of life of the coup and I don't know, against, it just is very complicated, and I was just pushing a little bit against the immediate identification with the Palestinian and the Crow. That's all. Anyway, I'm sorry.
I will try to be quick. So, I mean, one thing is that I foreground the university because, after all, it's what we are, teachers in university, and so it's a very extremely limited position with respect to the big issues we're discussing. But I think it makes sense to ask how it translates in this context. Second, Bateson actually, he thought the role of the university was very important with respect to that, and he was actually a trustee at the end of his life of the University of California system. Okay, he tried actually to force them to close Los Alamos. Okay, so for example, he thought it was not a good idea to have a university involved in atomic bomb research. It didn't work, but it's a good question actually. The question of, the ethics of the research which is done in a university. So again, I would say, I will not go into details or say. I know very often. At AUB, I see something, and I'm like, this is a bad idea. It's weird that we continue to do that, to teach this kind of stuff, for example, but I'm not going to denounce. I would say, again, the question is what we know, how does it translate for each of us into our practices as teachers, I would say. So in my department, for example, we cannot continue to do the social sciences as if this was not going on, actually, this global ecological catastrophe, which is going to change a lot of things. Okay, so how does it translate even at the level of the curriculum? I can see that, in fact, it's a very difficult question. It's extremely difficult to do. I could point to how actually our work itself is organized. So on the one side, we're having conversations like that. The universities sent a delegation to the COP, 25, and the one in the Gulf. And at the same time, and so we're like, we have to take this seriously, and at the same time, we're still in a system that not only rewards academic travel, but in fact forces you at some level into academic travel, which immediately puts you there in like the top 2% of the like plain polluters of the world. And then I would say, actually, I will not go into that, but there is a question of students. I'm a bit surprised about I'm a bit surprised by the level of ecological illiteracy of AUB students, I must say, the ones I had, the undergrads, and so it's I wish I was living in a university where, for example, so we had a cafeteria. This is also what I mean, a cafeteria which served good food. It was the hospital cafeteria, an extension on the AUB campus. It was fine, it was cheap, it was in like real plates, real forks, etc. They change it over the summer. They give it to some external business. They outsource it. Now everything comes packaged in plastic. It's twice as expensive. It's a disaster. So I would say it was a bad idea, a bad ecological idea. But I mean that in the sense that it's also at this level, actually, that you do ecological education. if you're a university with self-respect on this, don't do that, you know. And so I wish I was in a university where, when this happened, like after 2 weeks, there would be a group of students who disrupts the cafeteria and forces the university to return to something else.